Zimbabwe is bankrupt, and President Cyril Ramaphosa's recent visit there has increased speculation that South Africa will have no choice but to bail out our northern neighbour, given the economic and social impact on South Africa. Joining us to discuss the issue via Skype is Crystal Orderson from the Africa Report, and also joining us from Cape Town, from our studios actually, is Professor Brian Raftopoulos, a Zimbabwean, a leading scholar and activist. Warm welcome to you both, Professor Raftopoulos, Crystal Orderson. Thank you so much for making it to the fix. Professor Raftopoulos, I'm going to start with you, and I just want our listeners to bear with us. There's a slight delay in the time. There are rumours that the binational commission was discussed in Cabinet. I've certainly heard that Cabinet has in principle decided to assist Zimbabwe because it simply has no choice. If it does so, what do you think the chief form of assistance should be?
Well, at this moment, we're not quite sure what the South African government can actually do, given the challenges that are faced here by the South African state. But obviously for the South African government, from the Mbeki period until the present, the major objective of South African intervention has been to stabilize Zimbabwe, preferably under a reformed, or what they perceive as a reformed ZANU-PF. So I think the implications are they will want to stabilize the Mnangagwa regime, and which is also why they very quickly have moved towards trying to get the sanctions removed on the Zimbabwe government.
Crystal, let me come to you. I mean, you work with the granular detail. You speak to activists, opposition leaders. Can any lending agreement or line of credit be extended to the Zimbabwean government that does not involve the opposition, considering the way in which Emmerson Mnangagwa has responded to challenges to his rule, to the outcome of the elections?
Karima, I think firstly, you know, the IMF was in the country following South Africa's visit last week, Ramaphosa's binational commission. And what we hear from IMF and other sources in the country is that South Africa will form part of a consortium that is set to raise about $2.2 billion. France and Japan will be part of that consortium. And that's, of course, if President Mnangagwa and, of course, the finance minister, Ntuli Nube, can get the economic reforms needed over the next few months. And I think that's what's ultimately at play now. I mean, we of course hear the opposition leader, the MDC, you know, saying that, you know, they need to be part of discussions. We also know that when the US, for instance, announced that they're going to extend that sanctions for an additional year, the MDC had welcomed it. I think right now international financiers are looking at how can they stabilize Zimbabwe? And we know that last week the finance minister was in Paris. He, of course, is a former African Development Bank executive, has a personal line to some of those bankers. And I think it's this deal that they're trying to restructure that they need to put on the table, and South Africa being a very important player in that. And I think we have discussed over the past few weeks, you know, South Africa's role. Can they allow Zimbabwe to fail, become another poor province? And I think Cyril Ramaphosa is saying, no, this can't happen. And I do think we're going to hear the exact nature of this bailout in the coming days, Karima, because I think South Africa has no choice but to come to the assistance of Zimbabwe. And I think in that way, they will then able to leverage and get President Mnangagwa to start talking to the opposition and get some serious dialogue going on between the different parties.
Peter?
Yeah, Prof, and Prof, I just wanted to ask you, listening to Crystal, I hadn't heard about this international consortium before, and it sounds like quite an interesting idea. But none of this money is going to come without conditions. And if you were lending $2 billion to Zimbabwe, what would you ask of them? And is there any point in asking Emmerson Mnangagwa to make reforms if the army is also not at the table agreeing to or not agreeing to X or Y, because clearly they run him?
Look, I mean, it's clear that President Mnangagwa has set out his own agenda. there's only a certain levels of reforms that he will agree to, particularly political reforms. At this stage, he has no intention of talking to the major opposition party, which is led by Nelson Chamisa, and that would be a prerequisite for moving forward. There are all kinds of other activities going on in terms of what he considers dialogue with parties who have no real presence in terms of their support. And at the moment, I think one of the major things you would want to see is a serious national dialogue between the major political parties. Because whether he likes it or not, President Mnangagwa's legitimacy is still at stake, and that is an issue that is going to continue to condition responses to what's going on in Zimbabwe.
But Crystal, would that be enough? Would the mere beginning of a dialogue with the main opposition, would that be enough? Would that be $2 billion worth of reform enough, do you think? Or will they want more?
Absolutely not, Peter. I think the international bankers and South Africa would want more. In fact, a report emerged from Zim with confidential minutes where they say South Africa now wants to be part of the meetings when Treasury officials meet, when the Zimbabweans meet, because they say they need to see a plan, a workable plan, and a real serious, a real commitment of the changes needed, the hard changes that needs to happen. And of course, I don't think the sort of ZANU-PF strongholds within the country is going to take kind to South African Treasury officials sitting in on Zimbabwe finance meetings. But I think those are part of the kind of real conditions that Cyril Ramaphosa is putting down. He's saying domestically, South African can ill afford, just to give out money. Yeah. There needs to be serious concessions, and I think those are part of the negotiations. And I do think that given also that France is going to be a major player, I think that's going to further put some pressure, because Peter, we're looking at what, 1.3 billion in arrears that they owe, another 2.2 to the World Bank, and I think it's settling of that arrears, the real sort of technocratic nature of that discussion, that I think my sense is that Zimbabwe is not going to have a much say or have much of a choice but to make some of the hard decisions. And I do think the political sort of concessions and compromise is going to come into that discussion.
Professor, I want to come in here. Sorry, Peter. The points that Crystal is making are very granular, detailed points, and one can understand why South Africa would want that, considering what is at stake. But if you look at the internal politics and the battle within ZANU-PF, what Peter mentioned earlier, that the army essentially runs Emmerson Mnangagwa. The army chief is not necessarily at one with Mnangagwa around the kinds of conditions that Crystal is talking about. How strong is Emmerson Mnangagwa to sell this to a necessary constituency that needs to be part of it, never mind the opposition? How strong is he in ZANU-PF to sell this?
I think that's a central challenge that he faces. Once you come to power on the basis of the army, and the army which has a central stake in the current distortions in the economy, which has a central stake in the kind of patronage networks and corruption that is going on. And if you're trying to sell a reform program to those very forces which could be undermined by a reform process, you've got a real challenge. And this is part of the situation that we're in at the moment. And I think, I'm not sure that the South African government is fully aware of those kind of constraints. They may well be. But I think this is a central problem, and one that Mnangagwa faced immediately on coming to power on the basis of a coup.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah, no, I mean, South Africa is right to want to have to be at that table. It's part of the new way. If the SABC wants money, they're going to have to take, they're going to have to take somebody from Treasury into the building. I can't see how you negotiate with Mnangagwa unless actually you've got the head of the army sitting right next to him, nodding or shaking his head, because you won't know, Prof. I mean, you might as well just negotiate directly with the head of the army. I know you can't, but $2 billion is a lot of money.
Indeed, it's a great deal of money, and as I said, the constraints that this regime faces in terms of moving forward are huge. The problem, of course, is also that the opposition at the moment is not in a position to go any further, to push any more, because it faces a very coercive state, a state which is prepared to use violence, and a state which knows it will get the support of SADC and the AU in using that violence, as it has done, and without any serious consequences of accountability.
Crystal, I want to bring you in here and latch on to what Prof is saying. The fact that Zimbabwe has always been able to count on the support of SADC, the support of the AU, this resistance to Western intervention. We now have a consortium of bankers that includes France, who has a considerable stake in the rest of Africa, South Africa's major competitor, if you like. We've got Japan around the table. Is the opposition mature enough to understand the gravity of the moment and what is at stake? Are they also prepared to make concessions and to come to the table? They've been quite hard-lined on some of the issues. And what you require here now is statesmanship, isn't it?
Absolutely, Karima, and I think that's part of the challenge. I mean, we see, for instance, Emmanuel Macron, he just completed a visit to Ethiopia and Kenya, and we're talking big business. We know, for instance, Ethiopia's sector is opening up, they're ready to semi-privatize, and France is there. So one mustn't underscore that. These countries are also looking at the economic potential that a reformed Zimbabwe could potentially have to the SADC region, but for the rest of the continent. And they're looking at the long game. And I think in the meantime, I think, South Africa still plays a very leading role within SADC, within the African Union, and have been part of basically getting the leadership or, the kind of bodies to basically, give the nod to Zimbabwe when, something bad happens. We saw recently with that sort of post-election violence and, of course, the sort of protests that we saw. But I do think that's where, Cyril Ramaphosa is coming in with a new thinking, because I think, firstly, he recognizes that we cannot have another failed state on the door step of South Africa, because ultimately it has implications on what happens here. And so, one, he believes that, the economic reforms has to happen. South Africa will be Zimbabwe's biggest cheerleader, getting those sanctions lifted, because it's quite interesting the sort of impact of the US sanctions have had on the country, really devastating on, of course, the banks, of course, for trade, etc. And that's a major factor. And then, of course, I think if you have France as the European sort of leader, so to say, at the moment, leading the pack, there could be some talks of getting, the EU to also relook at some of the sanctions, because we know, for instance, that the UK have sort of checked out of Zimbabwe. They've got Brexit. They simply don't have the domestic capacity to deal what's happening in Zimbabwe. Then we have Japan as a major Asian player. They have TIGAD, which is, their sort of investment arm. They're playing a major role. And so I think they want to first get that sort of economic blueprint, and I think then dealing with the opposition, because I think there's a realization, as the Professor Raftopoulos have pointed out, the fragmentation of that opposition. And I think the MDC in the form of Nelson Chamisa have not shown the decisive leadership that many had hoped he would show, and I think they still weighing up how exactly they could potentially engage with Chamisa.
Professor Raftopoulos, I don't know if you're a betting man, but this initiative to involve France, Japan, and South Africa, and South Africa's real intimate involvement in sitting with the Zimbabwean finance minister, for example, looking at the monies and so on, and considering the conditionalities that you've explained that exist in the country, the contradictions, those who might be scared of this kind of reform. What chances do you give this initiative, as a final question?
I think it's a very fragile initiative, and given the record of this state, given the record of this government, given the manner in which it has dealt with the possibility of reforms in the past, I'm very, very skeptical of how this is going to come about. For a regime like this, it's the little reforms which accumulate, in which it loses control of the politics of change, is what it fears the most. And any kind of economic reform which is going to open up the possibilities of political accountability, is going to be a serious challenge to the Mnangagwa regime.
Thank you so much, Professor Brian Raftopoulos, and of course, Crystal Orderson, speaking to us there about the fact that we are likely to hear in the next coming days a deal that has been worked out. But Professor Raftopoulos, of course, saying that it is a very fragile thing. He does not know if it will work. Up next, we're taking a look at some of the stories that are making news headlines in our weekend papers.